All right. So yeah, so we're going to actually talk about the project now. Now, I'll kind of put a little caveat is that we didn't technically finish on our study groups about talking about section 32, which I think was like, what was it? We didn't talk about autocorrelation. We didn't talk about autoregressive models or the moving average models, any of those like modeling, like beyond just the white noise and random walk. So I think what we'll do next week is that maybe I'll set up those office hours is that we'll talk about those parts of the subject. So hopefully then also you guys will have some time to go through it, digest a little bit of section 31 and 32, maybe look at the project a little bit, and you can move from there. So sound like a good idea for you guys? Cool. All right, cool. So I'm gonna go ahead, start sharing my screen. And so this notebook I'm first gonna show you guys is going to be, it's already a notebook that's in the repo. So I believe, and I'll show you guys real quickly because I think sometimes it's a little hard to navigate. I think I should get like a little like navigation on this on the README for this resource because it's starting to get a little crowded, right? So like everything we talked about was under statistical modeling. That's really like our module 4 equivalent. But our project, I'll list everything about projects and stuff. I'm trying to keep it kind of all connected there. And so you can see is that for the time series project, I have a little notebook here. I also have I debate about putting the starter notebook itself in there. I think I'm not going to since it's already in the repo, and I'll show you guys what that looks like. But anyway, this is what this project intro. So I think I've shown you some like a variation of this already. So this is going to be more like review kind of things, but I think it's useful to go through. Note that this project is going to be focused on the time series and everything like that. I'm actually going to drop over to details of the project first, since that's really what's important, and then I'll talk about requirements and stuff. So here's just a link. You guys will have a slightly different link for the project itself. Note if you go into the repo, or not the repo, on learn.co, it's the same exact project. Note that it's basically going to be focused on time series. It's technically called, like, I think time series like model or something, like, or modeling project or something. Be aware that like that's not the full focus of it. There's actually a little bit more to it in the sense of that you don't want to simply just model. That's not the whole goal. Your goal is basically to do, well, you're asked a question essentially, like what are the top 5 best zip codes to invest in? And note that this question has a lot of ambiguity, right? Like what is the best to invest in? That's debatable, right? Best could mean like, what was the one that performed the best over the past, 20 plus years or however long the data set is collected for. It could mean like, what is the least volatile, right? So maybe you want data, or not data, but investments that are less volatile. Maybe that's what's your investor. You have to decide what your best it's going to be. I've had some really interesting, ways people approach this. There is no like wrong answer. I think the curriculum even says like, you don't have to really defend what your best really is. Just you can give some general idea. So I had one person do, for example, they picked different zip codes essentially that made more balance. So like they weren't all the same zip code in one area, and they said, well, this helps to be a little less volatile and stuff like that, and still performing those areas. I'm like, oh, that's a pretty cool idea. So you might have to decide like, the 5 collectively together is the best. So it doesn't have to be like under one metric. Okay, but the important part is actually finding what those zip codes are. So I'm going to tell you guys right now is that this Zillow data set basically contains pretty much like every, I could be wrong, but it's basically all the zip codes in the United States. So you can imagine that's a lot of zip codes, right? So one thing to note is that you do not have to look at every single zip code. That is a lot to take in. If you want to frame your like 5 best and like a fake scenario in a little bit, being like, oh, well, my area is really like my investors are really only looking at Texas or something like that. That's a perfectly valid way to kind of go about it. I don't want you to stress out trying to like go from many, zip codes. I want you to really focus on trying to take a subset of zip codes and really trying to figure out, how would you answer this question? What is best? Okay. So note that you don't have to try to model, for example, every single zip code. Don't do that. It'll take too long and it'll probably not do well on your computer. All right. So, and then probably gonna other things too. But the main thing is that for the project to be turned in and everything, we have our same requirements. We're going to have a Jupyter notebook, right, which is your technical aspect, exploration. So you explore the data, give reasoning within Markdown kind of deal. And then ultimately you might say like, okay, like you might use modeling, for example. I expect probably a little bit of modeling to see how well these 5 best zip codes will perform in the future. You can do that modeling in different ways. Some people have done where they might have a set of zip codes, maybe like even up to like 15 zip codes, and they might test out and then try to model each one and see which one will perform based on their model in the future. You don't have to do it that way. You can also use model and say, okay, I picked these 5 best zip codes based on these criteria that I've investigated, explored, and now I'm going to try to model these 5 best zip codes. So this project has a lot more fluidity, or it's a lot more fluid than what we've had in the past couple projects. Okay, so I just want to make that really clear. But that you'll have your technical notebook, right? So on GitHub, you also have your blog posts. Okay, so the blog post, I think the curriculum might talk about something like specifically what to say on the blog post. Again, it's a little more open to whatever you guys want to like talk about. I would say gear it towards some technical aspect. I would say, I don't think anyone's done this too much, but like steer away from doing things like, oh, this project was really fun, and like, you know, like just vague kind of like, oh, a project. This is kind of to show a little bit of like, you know, if you wanted to talk about something interesting about time series or explore an aspect of this, or, you know, set your overall process too, that could be useful. I try to focus on like one technical aspect. Like if you want to talk about how you visualized these time series and you want to talk about that. If you want to talk about the modeling aspect of like the time series, that would be something you could do as well. I think the more focused you are, the easier it is to write about it versus trying to write about everything. It just kind of gets a little more watered down. Okay. And then of course we have like, they say like executive summary, PowerPoint presentation, or non-technical presentation. So this is basically explaining your rationale and methodology, basically to saying how you found these best zip codes. Again, think of it more of a non-technical audience. You can adjust this one probably of the sense like, you know, what someone knows as non-technical. For example, talking to someone might know what ROI is, you know, versus someone like, if you're talking about something else, like maybe they don't know what ROI is, or, you know, anything along those lines. But so definitely adjust it to what you think for a non-technical presentation. But I think for the most part, you'd want to steer clear from like showing direct code, right? If you do a visualization, make sure your visualization is understandable. This is true even for your technical notebook, is that, remember, there's exploratory visualizations and explanatory visualizations. Your exploratory can be a little messy, can be a little kind of hard to understand, but then you're going to explore it more. Your explanatory should be a little cleaner, a little more focused, a little bit easier for anyone, whether it's technical, maybe non-technical. The main thing is that you can look at that and someone says, oh, I understand what you're trying to point out to me. Just kind of scrolling down here, there's an example of probably a good, like a fine exploratory, just to kind of see the general change, right, of these values, but probably not the best explanatory in the sense that this would not be your final graph to say, oh, look, we have this thing. You probably want to summarize this. What are some ways you could probably like just kind of spitball on here is what ways you could probably take the same data or take this data and make it cleaner, or, you know, maybe present it differently, closer to like an explanatory. So one simple one you can just do is, if these were all different like groups in like different counties, maybe for example, you can split them up. Say, okay, this is this county, this is this county, this is this county, put in different groups. Other thing is just literally just like kind of on the swings, just pick the ones that are kind of like in this area to get a feel for what these different time series are going through too. So you can say, okay, let me plot like 2 of them that are doing this general trend here, 2 of them that are in this kind of general trend. And that way you can make it a little clearer. Say, okay, if your focus is like, oh, there's a huge spread of these different values and whatever, you might just make it so there's like, instead of like, you know, however many is in here, it's got to be at least like 30, right? But like maybe reduce it down to like 10 of them, so that's a little bit easier to see. Okay, cool. All right. So anyway, these are your parts, and then you'll notice there's also a part that says your README. So your README is kind of this new aspect that we're asking for. It's kind of one of those things, like I would say, like going off of this is that you should probably go back to your old other projects and add a README if you haven't already. We'll talk about this maybe in office hours, but basically your README file is going to describe what your project is. Basically an introduction to someone first goes to your GitHub. They can read what's going on, the README, right? So basically it's telling the reader to like read this to understand what this repo is about. Okay, so we can talk more about this as well. And what is like good ways to make it README. The most simplest one, honestly, is just taking your notebook and transforming it into a README, which is a markdown file. Okay. Any questions so far? All right, so just remember all 4 of these parts will be needed to be turned into your project or to do your assessment. Okay. Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
So do we also need to record the presentation like we did for the previous?
Oh, I'm sorry, I almost forgot. Yeah, this should actually, that should be added into here too. I'm gonna make a note of that. Okay. Thank you. Yes, but it should still have a recording just like before. Okay, and also like I kind of say like use that recording as like a practice essentially. Like, you know, you don't necessarily have to like don't redo your like recording over and over and over again. But like once you kind of get a little practice, try to do the recording. You know, you might do a little hiccup here or there or whatever. But it was useful. It's like, okay, like that took me 6 minutes long. You're like, okay, cool. And you can kind of, if you want to, I know sometimes people don't want to hear their own voices, but sometimes it might be useful to say, oh, you know, did I talk about the things I really wanted to? And, you know, it doesn't have to be perfect, but I think it's a useful kind of tool. Okay, cool. Thank you for catching that because I've totally forgot about the recording. And also it looks like the curriculum kind of forgot that too. So I'll have to tell them to update those parts. Okay. All right, so all right, any questions about anything I talked about for this, this project kind of coming up? No? Okay, cool. So one thing I will note is that this project, as always, has the CSV, the data itself in here, which is really useful, so you don't have to collect any data. This data format is a little bit different than what we've seen already in the time series. So what is nice is that the curriculum actually adds in a starter notebook that can be used. You don't have to use it, but it can be useful. So I just loaded up in here, Jupyter Notebook here. Oops, let's go ahead and make it so I can actually read these things. Okay. So you can see the notebook is kind of formatted in this way. You do not have to use the starter notebook. You can take the starter notebook and readjust it if it helps you. If you find like, you know what, this is not really, I'm not really understanding how this functions, you can change it or like completely do something different. But this is to kind of help you out a little bit. So I would suggest like at least reading it through and seeing, you know, this part. But the biggest thing, reason why we do this is that we have this wide versus long format. So if you look at the data, if you load it in and actually do like your df.head, you'll see that it's basically represented in this way. And note that region ID is the zip code. And that you'll see that the data is actually formatted in like this month, like year, month, you know, kind of in the column. We don't, like if you look at, think of the time series that we've done that with the time series is like the index, right? So it looks closer to this kind of format, which is what we call a long format. So just to kind of help you guys out in the sense of that, like that way you don't have to worry about like trying to make this go from here to here so you can actually do your time series like you typically would. There's some helper functions built into here, which include like this get date times, but also this melting right here. So this can actually be used to help you basically get the relevant information into that format here. So my suggestion is before you even do any EDA, and this is where you'll notice that the starter notebook has it formatted EDA, visualization, then reshaping. I think this is because the person who wrote this notebook just happened to approach it in this way. Me personally, I probably would have put this something like up here, like so I could like make it in this format. Right, and then continue on to the EDA. But of course, if you find it useful in another way, that's perfectly fine. I think this is something that I'll make sure we actually explicitly go over in an office hours. And that way we can make sure you can do this part, because I don't want you guys to bang your head over like the whole day trying to get from here to here. I want you guys to get into the data right away. Okay, but it's useful to know that sometimes data doesn't come in the format that you want. Okay, but anyway, that's kind of the starter notebook, and you can see here, they're basically loading the data itself. You might filter basically saying which zip codes. You might want to just melt it into a long format right away. It's up to you. And then actually doing the data processing and like EDA, essentially exploring and everything, doing a visualization. Your visualization is probably a big aspect of this project. Is if you give a reason for like, oh, I'm looking for this specific aspect, it's a good, like you really should be visualizing it. Basically say, okay, this is why I see these different aspects I'm going through. Okay. And then you might see later on, you might try doing a modeling. Notice they put a Readme modeling. You don't have to use Readme modeling. Some people have had good experiences with using Facebook Profit, which is in the curriculum, but you don't have to use these specific modeling techniques. But I think I would like to see, I'm trying to remember from the curriculum, from the rubric that we have, which is on the Learn homepage. I'm pretty sure I require at least one model. And that's because I want you to make sure to get experience trying to model out a time series. But note that you don't have to make the modeling your central focus of the whole project. Okay. And then of course, always interpret your results, which includes your conclusion, your recommendations, right? Saying like what was the result of this? Why do you recommend these things? You know, are these meaningful? Or you can even say like, you know, maybe it doesn't really matter much between like these 10 zip codes, but I chose these 5. And then of course, future work, explicitly stating what would you do next? You know, what would be the next goal, or what other things could you do, either using more data or other techniques. Okay. Does that make sense for everyone for how this kind of starter notebook setup? Cool. Any questions at all about this guy? Okay, cool. I'm sure you guys will, as you get into it, you guys will likely have questions, which is perfectly good. All right. So, so kind of focus, kind of reiterating some stuff. Remember business case. Remember like what is the goal of it. Make sure you focus on that part. That will help you out. Don't do every zip code. Narrow it down in some way. That will be helpful for you. You can, if you want to try for fun, try like do different sections and what's it called? Do visualizations of all the zip codes in some form or fashion. But I would say do not force don't try to push yourself into doing that way. Okay. And then just remember for pre-process or for processing the data, there are missing data. So just kind of be aware of that. There are some null values. Note that the first initial part is not formatted into our typical long format. You might also need to get rid of some certain columns. Some columns just aren't relevant to this time series, so you could just get rid of that. Again, using the melt function. I mentioned this before the starter notebook existed, but that helper function uses the melt function, which can be useful. And then just don't forget your EDA. And also, like I said, region names are zip codes. You're like, where are the zip codes? It's just the region. If you look at actually here, the region ID, or I'm sorry, not region ID, I'm messing this up. The region name is the zip code itself. Okay, so if you're kind of curious, you can probably pull up your own zip code and kind of find out which one it is. So that might help. Okay, all right. So those are some basic stuff just about the time series project itself. I did want to go over just quickly some advice. So like I said, your notebook, make it clean and organized. These are things that we've already talked about before. I think you might have literally seen a form of this before. Give me a thumbs up if this kind of looks familiar. I've shown you guys. Okay, I see a nod or two. All right, so yeah, basically keep your notebook organized. I like to say a narrative is always really first helpful for you, but also it's really helpful to guide the reader through. So I think as people, we tend to do really well with narratives. So if you can frame your work in a narrative format, it's usually really helps you out. One way you can kind of do this too is making sure you periodically just go from top to bottom to see, does everything make sense, or are things out of order here? This also helps if you do like a kernel restart and literally run top to bottom, because then you know for sure that there's not some weirdness where you jumped up and down from some cells, like you might sometimes see me when I do it in study groups. Okay. And just remember, the last part's more of a conversation with a data-minded person, which I think you guys got the feel for this already. This is going to be your, what, 4th project? Is that right? Or 3rd project? 3rd project, right? Okay, yeah, so you guys, this is not new to you guys, so cool. All right, just remember presentation, keep it around 5 minutes. 3 minutes is really the shortest. 8 minutes is kind of like, that's just about high enough. I technically won't stop you at 10 minutes, but past 10 minutes, that's way too long. And it's good practice to try to remember, you're not gonna say everything, right? You're gonna keep it within that 5-minute part. I'll iterate this over and over again. These are kind of my preferences, but I think they're important. You are the subject of the presentation, not the slides. I would say the info on those slides emphasize your points that you say verbally. I think you guys have been doing a really great job doing this. I've actually heard some really great things from Dara, especially from the last time we did a show and tell. I think it was like actually the first project that she was like, oh, this is really great. Like you guys are doing great. And I said, I love to take credit for it, but I think it's them. I think they're already doing a great job. So again, just use the info to really emphasize your points, okay? And then less is more. I think it's easy to put a lot of things on a slide. Fight that temptation. It's really easy to try to throw all this information on the slide. If you really feel like it's important, what I always try to suggest is see if you can split it up into different slides and then look at it when it's on a slide by itself. One is that like you can go through the same like amount of information, just the slides go through quicker. The curriculum has like 5 to 10 slides. I think that's not really a thing. Like I don't look at number of slides. That's not the important part, right? But if you split into different slides and then you find out like this one slide, you're like, is there really any information that I'm giving here that's important? You can remove that. You're like, oh, this doesn't make sense. So think of it in that way. And just know, I think most people understand too many words on paper, but also too much information on a visualization. Try to keep it clean to make it easy to digest. Okay. And then I make a little joke here of just my amazing presentation tips, right? Of course, these are all like my opinions. Don't feel like this is the rule or I'm gonna like fail you if you don't follow these exact things. These are just things I find useful, but you can, break the rules, right? So I say each slide contains one thought or concept, right? Just having more slides, like I said, ideally the slides might be introduce or summarize what you're saying. So you might have like literally a single picture that kind of like relates to what you're about to talk about, or it can be something where it's summarizing what you're about to say. Like, okay, I did this whole process, I looked at these zip codes and whatever, and then maybe your one slide says best zip codes and list those zip codes. That could be your whole slide, but you're talking about that thing and it's summarizing everything you're talking about, okay? I say no more than 3 bullets. I would even keep it like to 2, but like 3 bullets per slide, it's probably as much as you really need to have. Just know that basically the more you have, it just might be easier to split into slides, especially if it's a very big concept. For example, in the sense of doing recommendations, if you have multiple recommendations, really split it up and say, okay, these are my different recommendations. This one might be a little bit different because you're looking at 5 different zip codes, but if there's a reason for those 5 different zip codes, maybe you chose 2 and it's because they're related to each other. Maybe I'm gonna make something up. You pick 2 zip codes because it's rural, 2 zip codes because it's urban, and 2 zip code because it's suburban. Yeah. You can have those in different slides, right? So that's what I mean by like kind of focus them together. Use sentence fragments. Like you can see here, like I can guarantee you guys are all reading this right now, right? The more you have the sentence and the more words you have, the more that people are just gonna like just focus on that and miss what you're saying. So sentence fragments help kind of emphasize the points. And English is really redundant. You don't need all those extra prepositions and ands and stuff like that. People get what you're saying. You might not want to talk like that, but you can write down that because you're going to emphasize those points, okay? Unless it's a formal definition, okay? And then visuals and pictures, don't get complicated, right? Just like having too much sentences. Stick to a visualization. If you have a visualization, make sure you talk about it. Please don't do this. I've seen a lot of people do this, not just you guys, but everyone in general. They'll do a visualization and you're like, oh, that's really interesting. And then they never talk about it. And you're just like, but why? Like, why were you showing me this? Make sure if you show a visualization, there's a reason why you're showing it. And just to know that pictures can help basically summarize things. And a picture can also be like, I've seen people do for visual emphasis is if there's like, oh, there's a number, like, oh, 34%, is the value. You can literally have 34% as your visualization. Like that could be a visualization. And that's the whole point. So it's emphasizing what you're talking about. Do they know what the 34% is when they first see it? Maybe not, but you're going to say what that is. That's the important aspect. Okay, cool. And then video, blog. I'm not going to go into that part. Just practice and your blog. Code snippets, visualizations, technical. I know you guys are getting, a lot of you guys are very, might have more talent in writing and stuff like that. Feel free to share with each other too. I think it'll be useful. Yeah, cool. Any questions about anything about the project, format? Cool. All right. Well, cool. I guess I'll go stop sharing here and stop recording. Sound good? Okay.